Welcome back to the Employee Advocacy and Influence podcast. My name is Lewis Gray. I'm a senior marketing manager here at Disseminate. My co-host is Elliot Elsley, and our expert guest for today's episode is Erik Frølund. So Erik is a employer brand lead and communication specialist at 3Shape and is currently managing what we would call a grassroots employee advocacy program. And what we mean by that is just a program without a dedicated tool. He's been on a really fascinating journey over the past 5 years, and there's a couple of things to look forward to in this conversation. So I'll try and summarize some key takeaways. But firstly, we spoke about the reasons why they decided to explore employee advocacy and how they identified their ideal advocates from day one. So that initial group of employees who they were going to select to become advocates. We spoke about how they balance authenticity when they are providing their employees with posts to share, and how Erik goes on to encourage and empower people to add their own tone of voice while still being compliant and in line with governance. And then lastly, we spoke about why they chose to get senior leaders involved from day one, and some of the challenges that Erik has had in communicating the personal benefits to employees to scale this thing, essentially. So it's a really fascinating chat, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So without further ado, let's get into it.
So my name is Erik Frølund, and I'm an employer branding lead and communication specialist at 3Shape. And 3Shape is a company that designs hardware and software solutions for dentistry. So we're in the medtech industry. I started as a student, also working with employer branding. I did that for 2 years, and then I was offered a full-time role building up the employer branding function into what it is now. It started somewhere else, then it was moved to people and culture, and now it's an integrated part of what we call corporate communications. So it's been a bit of a journey in these 5 years. Learned a lot of some things along the way that I'm going to be excited to share with you today.
That's awesome. Yeah. And that's what stood out to me in our initial conversations, to be honest with you. It sounds like it's been a roller coaster 5 years, but what you've achieved in that time is impressive. So as you say, we'll get into a lot of that in this conversation, but just right off the bat, Erik, what was the original challenge that led you to launching it? Well, I know it's a grassroots program initially, so you didn't have a tool or anything along those lines, but what was the original challenge that led you to launch that advocacy program?
Yeah. So I think actually we need to jump back to that student life when I was hired as a student assistant, because back then, employer branding was a part of our research and development department, and it was a part of a little team that was called in-house consulting. That meant that I was surrounded by engineers, developers, project managers, and absurdly, that also meant that I knew little to nothing about the topic, but I was still considered, the expert in that team as a student. The job was quite simple, though. It was to attract top talent for R&D teams. So to make things, even more interesting, 3Shape was almost invisible, and this was not by accident. It was completely by choice, because back then, the founders believed, kind of like those who live silent live well. That meant, they were, I wouldn't call it anxiety, but they were very careful with what information was shared and what wasn't. And they didn't really see I should be careful with what I say, right? But the true value in PR and external audiences besides, customers and partners. So as you can imagine, you had a completely non-existing employer brand. It was kind of like 3Shape who. So the challenge was, quite clear.
Odds stacked against you a little bit there.
Definitely, yeah. So eventually, when I got a little bit more into the gig of this student role, it was quite clear that we needed to activate some of the people inside the company who had access to some of these tech specialist networks that I couldn't afford to gain access to, because of the conditions, basically. Right? So we had to somehow choose some of our employees to be our storytellers and to be that, channel between us and the network that we were actually interested in attracting and talking to.
How did you go about identifying those initial advocates?
So I think we had quite a pragmatic approach. I always like to. Do you know the guy called Simon Sinek?
Yes. Yeah.
This is all copy. This is not my own wisdom. But basically, you need to imagine a bell curve, and it basically divides people into groups. So the target group that you're interested in conveying into doing something. And the first 2.5% are what he calls the innovators. So these are the big thinkers like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. Then you have the next 13% who are the early adopters. And these are people who are willing to try something new just because it reflects their own beliefs and their own values. So they would invest more of their time and their resources just because they think the idea is good. After that, you have the early and late majority, each constituting around 34%. And finally, you have the laggards. So back to the question, how did we identify the initial employees to choose? As you can imagine, most companies, they would intuitively target the big group, the bulk, and the majorities, because that's where the numbers are. But they'll also, in this theory, they're also the most skeptical. They will look at it, at your initiative, at the employer advocacy program, and they will think, what's in it for me? Are you going to pay me extra for, doing this job? In other words, they're not really going to invest anything in it until someone else has tried it first. And I know who these colleagues are, and I'm completely sure you have those colleagues as well.
Yeah, we're familiar.
So what this law of diffusion of innovations really tells us is that to gain mass adoption into a program or into a culture change or into a new initiative, we need to first engage that critical 15 to 18%, to reach that tipping point. So you don't start with the majorities, you actually completely ignore them. And what it looks like in practice was that instead of us doing a huge workshop and, global training programs and global mails and inviting everyone to participate, and we will force you into this, training program that we have designed. We started small and we selected a small group that we thought, would buy into the idea instantly. And it started with the top senior leaders. They, because they should walk the talk. They also had the biggest reach on LinkedIn and into the target group that we needed, especially, the R&D senior leaders. By design, they should be early adopters, right? And then, of course, we then chose a couple of leaders a bit further down the layers, and a couple of people who we thought, they would just instantly buy into the idea and think, that's cool. I want to help. Sounds great. And in return, we helped them build their LinkedIn profiles. We wrote different copy versions so they could adapt the tone to their own personal brand. And we created a simple, you could call it level system, where they could choose beforehand how much they wanted to be involved in it and how much effort they want to put into the program. And in that way, we didn't waste any energy on trying to convert this big skeptical majority, what's in it for me?
And I guess it's a bit of an unfair question because there's been a long timeline, but did you find that kind of majority, those people that are apathetic, more of them started to convert over time? Or did you, when you started kind of talking to other areas of the business, go, oh my goodness, this is so much easier to get these people on board compared to where I started with this?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I think we're going to touch a little bit upon it later as well, right? But it's always a challenge. I don't think there will never be a world where this target group, they will buy completely into the idea. Another big benefit of this kind of approach is that when you create this sort of small grassroots start, when you don't broadcast it right away, you create this ripple effect of what's going on here. What is this? I see something new is stirring, something new is moving. What is that? What are you doing? Why didn't I hear of this? And I mean, that is essentially what will turn into demand. So instead of, broadcasting it as an HR initiative where we came with the whip saying, oh, you need to do these programs and now you need to be activated even though you don't want to. We try to create a bit of demand first for it.
You always tend to find, or at least I've found in my experience as well, do you get stakeholders that initially were quite skeptical about it, all of a sudden go, well, I've actually got lots of content that I'd like everybody to share if that's okay. And you see it so often where all these people that weren't really that interested in it in the start, all of a sudden there's 500 people in an advocacy program or 1,000 or however many. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, no, I'd really like to be a part of this. I'd really like my content if you shared it. It's always a funny dichotomy that occurs with these people that suddenly reappear really quickly.
Elliot, I'm glad you've touched on that, because obviously when starting an advocacy program, the snowball effect, as you've just demonstrated, tends to take effect once those early wins start coming in. People see other people starting to gain traction. They see a bit of excitement and suddenly it's, okay, how do I get involved in this? But Erik, for you and your experience at 3Shape, what were the early indicators that showed you that this approach was working?
First of all, we saw a little bit of demand, right? So we started with the R&D senior leaders, and suddenly, we had several leaders reaching out to us asking if they could join the program too, because they think they should be part of it. I think also just for our listeners here, I think it could be valuable for them to know that this program wasn't, huge. We didn't have a software that gathered everyone and that could communicate easily the content out to them. This was literally just a mail list in Outlook. So we made an Excel document with their names, their emails, and with their reach on LinkedIn. And then we created a mail list on Outlook, and all of our advocacy communication went through that, Outlook on mail. So we don't have to, reinvent the wheel in order to start a practical grassroots movement, in order to start with advocacy. You don't have to, get buy-in from, 80% of your stakeholders around the global organization. You can literally just start with 20 people in a mail group, and you will see results right away. So the kind of results that we saw was basically I sat down with our SOMI manager, and we compared engagement metrics to the posts and the content that we shared in the group, and all of the content that we didn't share. Again, very manual work. We just counted, made an Excel document and compared engagement metrics. And I mean, the difference was quite significant. But of course, the most important KPI was that we created a demand right away.
Erik, one of the misconceptions that people have about employee advocacy programs is that when you're providing employees with posts, it removes authenticity. And then another misconception is the employee advocacy tools and programs result in people sharing duplicate content. But the reality is, as we've seen and as we know, if that's happening, it's usually because, unfortunately, the programs and the tools are being used poorly, and not enough is being done to ensure that every post is unique. And then there's also that lack of empowerment as well, I think. But in your experience, what challenges did you face when you were trying to maintain authenticity? Because I know you mentioned before about the fact that you were providing posts for employees to get things off the ground, but did you find it was difficult to kind of strike a balance to leverage authenticity, but also to ensure that people actually were still sharing?
Yes, definitely. It's a huge challenge. And I think you hit the nail here. I think before answering the question, I think it's important for the listeners to hear that LinkedIn was, of course, our main platform that we wanted to communicate this content on. And LinkedIn, by nature, poses its own challenge with authenticity and authentic communication. First of all, from a governance perspective, we didn't have that many restrictions back then. This was a couple of years ago, I need to mention. So we had loose guardrails at the time. Today, they are a bit stricter, I would say. But authenticity, of course, was very tricky. We mentioned earlier, that R&D talent, they're a skeptical bunch, They are allergic to anything that sounds like corporate fluff. My own stakeholders, they look at some of my content, even some of my articles, and then they write to me, they're like, Erik, this is corporate BS. And I'm like, why? I mean, I'm not, yeah, exactly. And then you combine, this view in corporate communication, you combine this view and perspective with the discourses of LinkedIn. And this kind of language that is LinkedIn, right? I'm honored and humbled to accept my driver's license and excited for spearheading the next chapters. And thank you to this senior person and this senior person. And you combine that, with this skeptical view of corporate communication, and you can imagine the challenge, right? And I think that's the real challenge, right? With LinkedIn and authenticity is how do you break away for that kind of LinkedIn speak? Because it's surprisingly hard. And I know it from myself. It's so comfortable to hide behind that kind of phrasing because that's generally accepted as, well, that's how you communicate on LinkedIn. And I think it's because when you try to write authentically, or if you try to do so right, you also have to show just a little piece of who you are. And I think that can feel very vulnerable. And I think that's the real challenge with authenticity on LinkedIn.
If I could ask on that point, Erik, how do you then encourage employees to show up as themselves? Because it's, like you said, people almost log into LinkedIn, and for a lot of people, they kind of switch their personality to the corporate version of themselves because they feel like they have to be a certain way. And as you've highlighted, when people do show up as themselves, they give us a little bit of behind the scenes of their role, whatever it might be. Generally speaking, that content tends to resonate much more than that corporate polished version of themselves. But what are you doing at 3Shape to make sure that people, I don't know, kind of add a bit of their own personality to their posts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I wish I could tell you that I had the magic recipe. I don't. I have a few experiences that I can share. Sometimes, it went perfectly well, and sometimes it didn't at all. But essentially, when we ask people, employees, to share content on LinkedIn, we're asking them to use their own personal brand for the benefit of the company. And it is a big ask, in my opinion, right? I understand the skeptical bunch, asking what's in it for me. Why should I do that? And it's absolutely crucial that, as you mentioned, Lewis, that we share something that feels authentic to them, that it should sound like their own voice, and we should guide the way and not control every single word. An example I can give was that when we launched our graduate program, which is a quite a popular program in Denmark, we promoted it to the advocacy group, and then instead of, we gave them a few lines, and we gave them a few different themes and a few different lines within every theme that they could, use as a starting point for their own post. But then essentially we asked them to try and connect it to their own story. So maybe reflect on back then when they were students, master students, and they were looking for their first job. What was the state of mind that you went there? What was your first job like? What did you think about when you went out into the big world and you needed to land your first full-time gig? What was your sentiment? How did you choose, what directions to go? Were you scared? Were you not? Was it exciting? Was it terrifying? And if you then look at this graduate program and you present that opportunity to yourself back then when you graduated, would you apply for it, and why or why not? I mean, there can still be quite a great content piece in explaining the why not. Maybe, you knew exactly, I want to be a finance bro. That's what I want to do. I'm just going to go in that direction and go directly to Patagonia and get the vest.
I was about to reference the vest. That's brilliant.
But, in reality, when you want to join for a graduate program, you want to explore your future opportunities. You don't want to set yourself in stone right away. You want to, investigate a little bit and learn a bit more about yourself. So we wanted to get those kind of conversations out. And for some of the stakeholders, for some of the advocates, it worked perfectly. They created beautiful stories about their own time and how scary it can be, to face the world as a fresh graduate. And in other cases, it worked horribly. You just had, a couple of, and I guess we can't expect everyone to be great copywriters. I guess that's a fair point to make. And that's our job as employer brand managers and as advocacy program managers to try and steer, that. But essentially, if we don't want to control every word, that's a barrier, that's a consequence of that kind of approach, that we will also get some content that is quite bad.
I think that's part of the fun is not always the thing people want to hear when it comes to bad content, but to a degree it is part of the fun, in my opinion, where it's actually, there's a lot of employees, a lot of these businesses that you're trying to encourage to share content. It's a hard thing to do. Like, there's a reason marketing as an industry exists. There's a reason copywriters exist, all of these different things. Like, you're trying to encourage people to do something that is fundamentally a job.
Yeah, so I think, not everyone can be considered great copywriters. And I think we should also, as communicators, as copywriters, as SOMI managers, we should accept that for quite many, it is exactly as you say, and it's a job, and it can be extremely terrifying. Especially when again, we consider the target group that we were dealing with, it's R&D talents. They want to excel. They want to be great at what they do. And they are extremely detail oriented. So it's every single word is weighed, and all of the risk behind each word is weighed as well. So it doesn't flow naturally for them. So it was definitely a challenge. And I think for us, it worked okay, this approach, because it was small, it was grassroots. We only had, the ones that struggled with the copy, we could, connect with them directly to help them.
It's where tooling like ours really comes into play as well, right? You can really funnel people directionally into, this is the type of content, this is the type of language that we want to use. And some people will use it for verbatim, and some people will really kind of dive into it. And there's lots of like little tweaks and changes, but it really, at that point, once you hit scale, it just becomes about kind of shifting people in a lane as much as you can and keeping them on the tracks.
Well, Erik, something I wanted to come on to is something that you actually touched on earlier in our conversation. So you mentioned about the fact that you got buy-in from senior leaders early on. You mentioned about people questioning the personal benefit, and something that we discussed in our initial conversation was about the fact that these things are just absolutely instrumental for long-term success. But you briefly touched on it, but could you just elaborate on why you chose to involve those senior leaders from the start?
In 3Shape, it's a part of our leadership values that all leaders should be culture ambassadors and walk the talk. So by nature, I also expected of them to be early adopters and to accept the circumstances right away. But of course, we persuaded them with using LinkedIn a bit more strategically for their own personal benefits as well. And try to help them, build their own personal profiles and their own presence. Help them, with the initial conversations on how you start to think about your own personal brand. And and I wish I could say that I had the recipe for our listeners now. I don't, because personal branding is, as the name suggests, very personal. So we can't, as advocacy managers or as communicators, we can't tell them what to do. It's something that needs to be manifested from within them. They need to find their own story. We can pose challenges, we can do workshops, we can ask them deep questions. And fundamentally, we need to ask them, are you even interested in showing a bit more of yourselves and communicating about yourself in this way before we can start? But that was basically why we initiated senior leadership to begin with.
I think that's a really interesting point as well. The challenge of you can't train the value to somebody that easily, I think is I think it's something a lot of people try to do, and almost to the point of like larger advocacy programs as well.
Yes, it definitely is. And just to add to the point of why it's important to engage senior leadership early on, I think for some of the employer brand professionals that listen right now, it has a strategic place as well, to engage senior leaders for the sake of employer branding as a function. It's a lot of internal visibility, and it's a great conversation starter, to help them build their own stories with your content.
So something I wanted to touch on, Erik, is the demonstrating that personal value. So it's kind of tying all of this together because, again, the only way to get something like this off the ground, employees need to be bought in. But how do you demonstrate that personal value to keep them engaged over time? We've touched on consistency and things like that, but what do you find worked or didn't work for you?
So to be completely honest, I think we failed here. When we started the program, we had great momentum, and we had at least a year where we saw great engagement, and all of our participants bought into the concept. But then after a year, engagement slowed naturally. We needed to reinvent the program or evolve it, develop it into something different, and we failed to do that. Corporate life happened, priorities changed, and we ended up, continuing the program as it was and harvested the benefit that we could from it. And then we focused resources elsewhere from there. But so that is the reality of where our advocacy program is right now. It's still, dormant. I think when hiring ramps up again at some point, we're going to initiate it again. And when we do, I think that's the relevant question to ask, right? How do we flip the focus on being from here's the content to now share to how do we help you build that personal brand on a larger scale? And I've given a little bit of a thought, and I think it's as you mentioned briefly, and we need to start with the success stories. So we need to choose a couple of employees that holds some power, that are an opinion leader, and ask them to share their success story from using the platform or from doing advocacy, whatever platform it is, and then show tangibly, what they gain from it. And the question I often get, and I imagine any other employer brand managers, they get the same. But then don't you risk that the advocate will just leave the company in favor of a greater opportunity?
The amount of times I've heard that sentence is unbelievable.
Exactly. And I think, of course, there will always be a risk, even if you're an advocate or not, right? But I think the trade-off is huge for the brand itself, right? So if you have a strong opinion leader or thought leader connected to your brand, it's a very powerful ambassador, especially targeting younger professionals, but also more senior.
I did just want to come back to the opportunities thing though, because yes, like there is always going to be a chance that somebody's going to get headhunted, but again, you're suffering from success at that point. But I think people forget the opportunities more often than not, from what we've seen, is that people just get promotions, they get hired for different roles internally. It's not necessarily that they're getting new jobs at other companies. It's, people like yourself, Erik, might notice that somebody is posting great content on LinkedIn. It's like, hey, do you want to be part of this thing? Or, they get brought into different departments, and it's actually kind of accelerating their career, but within the business. It's not necessarily that they're going to go work elsewhere. It just opens doors for them within their current company. But Erik, I appreciate you speaking so candidly about that, because I think it's just as important to acknowledge the failures, because then it's okay, what worked after that? What did we do to re-engage people? So what would you advise to teams trying to re-engage advocates or just scale their program?
So I think it in the end, it depends on where your challenges are in the recruitment funnel. If you're in the beginning, if you have issues with awareness, I would almost be tempted to say, go broad, scale up, make noise, get as many voices out there as possible. Kind of like no matter what, you can target the big majority and just go ahead. But if your challenges are also further down the funnel, if you have issues with those stages of consideration, interest, conversion, from initial contact to application, I think what we tried would be a good approach and a good way to start. Start with fewer people with a stronger reach, help them grow, help them position themselves, and then not by pushing corporate messages, but by helping them tell their own stories through your content.
I think when you've started small as well as you have, you've identified, I mean, you've got senior leaders on board, you've started with some key advocates, you've built that momentum. But Erik, we've covered so much ground today and you've shared so much insight with us. And again, I appreciate you speaking so candidly about it, because it's not always just from one success to another. Like Elliot alluded to, with advocates, it's a stepping stone for program managers and for people who are finding their voice on LinkedIn. So I wanted to thank you for sharing all of that with us today. And I guess the floor is yours now, Erik. Where can people keep up with you? Is it LinkedIn? And did you want to tell our listeners about what you've got going on at the moment?
Yeah, of course. What's going on the employer branding side is that I finally convinced my stakeholders to place employer branding within corporate communication. It's been a long journey. It started in R&D. It was moved to HR, and it was in HR for a long time. And when you struggle with awareness, like we did, it's sometimes difficult for HR to provide the tools that are necessary to tackle those challenges within awareness. So you need a lot of strategic partnerships across the organization. But with a strategy, with some insights, I managed to convince, quite a few stakeholders to buy in to this idea of moving employer branding into a more strategic position within corporate communication. And the reason that it's here is because I see employer branding, as long-term. I see it as a reputation tool. I don't only see it as a way to attract more talents down the recruitment funnel. So I'm very excited about where it is now. I'm only like half a year, a few months in, so I still need to, design the position, design my own efforts with the team that I'm now in. And we need to decide together what we want employer branding to be in this new context. But I think it's very exciting. It's a super exciting journey. So all the listeners who might, struggle with some of the same conversations, maybe they're in doubt about where they want employer branding to be. Maybe it's like a 20% position within TA, or it's under marketing and they struggle with, getting some of that more cultural people communication integrated with their marketing messages. Feel free to reach out, feel free to connect. I'm very open and candid about these sort of conversations. I think it's important that we as professionals, that we stick together and that we share experiences. So feel free to connect, and again, just write a little message when you connect that you listen to this episode. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, thank you, Erik. And from the employer brand managers that we've spoken to on the podcast before, I know that's a common challenge of kind of where does employer brand sit, because there's overlap with marketing, HR, talent acquisition, and so on. So yeah, connect with Erik on LinkedIn, as he said. If you have any questions, then he'll be, as he has been on this recording, forthcoming with information, which we always appreciate. But Erik, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. Pleasure was all mine. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, guys. We'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.